Jean-Pierre Melville had only made one short film, had no proper training in filmmaking, but was a great cinephile. In one sense, he was a precursor of the new wave by having learned the cinema by watching film. He adored the cinema. And he was determined to make a film about the resistance because he himself had been a member of the resistance. For him, this was like bringing his two passions together, which was the resistance and filmmaking. He decided to adapt a book by a writer called Vercors, which had come out during the war, was published in clandestinity, which was called Le Silence de la Mer. This was a book that, in a sense, gave Melville the guarantee of authenticity, that he was talking about the resistance based on the experience of a great member of the resistance. At the time, he was a nobody in the French film industry. He had no credentials. He had to fight the film industry to get the authorization to make the film. And in fact, he didn't get it. He still went ahead and made the film with a small crew. So he had to fight all these battles and eventually won over the writer. The story told by Melville is that he organized what he called a jury of great members of the resistance and said, if they approve my film, then we can go ahead. But if they don't, he was then burn the negative and destroy the film. And the story goes that out of 22 eminent members of the resistance, only one disapproved of the film. In a sense, this was giving Melville the authorization of official resistance. Vercors then became very involved in the shooting of the film by allowing it to take place in his own house. The great critic André Bazin said something very interesting, and I think absolutely true about it. He said, of course, Melville had to put up with too much interference from Vercors and had to fight the writer to make his film. At the same time, this gave him a fantastic amount of publicity. And the French press at the time of the making of the film was full of stories of the shooting and of the disagreements between Melville and Vercors. When Melville began to be involved in making Le Silence de la Mer as a relatively novice filmmaker, for him, cinema in the late 30s, and in particular Hollywood cinema, he was a great lover of American culture, and his name, Melville, isn't a name he assumed because he adored Herman Melville. For him, the cinema had reached perfection already. There was nothing new one could do unless one transformed film language, that there was no point in continuing to make the same classical films. And I think this is fascinating because these are the ideas, of course, that about 10 years later, again, the young critics and filmmakers of the new wave, like François Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard, would say exactly the same. And they did admire Melville, and I think that was another reason. The sense that the cinema should stop just telling stories in the way that it had done, and you have to innovate. It was time to do something different, to work on time, work on a cinema of interiority, a cinema that could tell characters' thoughts. Melville anticipated that with his film, and even more with the films that he would make later. Quite a bit later, in the early 60s, he made a film called Léon Morin, Prêtre, which is a little bit more explicit about collaboration and those divisions among the population, which is something that is totally absent from Le Silence de la Mer. You don't see anybody, more or less, hardly anyone outside the home. Then in 1969, Melville made a film called L'Armée des Ombres, The Army in the Shadows. It's a sort of return to a glorification of the resistance. It's quite striking that in all three cases, he adapted books that were recognized as great books of the resistance. These are people who themselves went through it, and therefore they're telling the truth. Vercors' book was partly autobiographical. Vercors created the character of the German officer I think it's a composite between somebody who had been billeted in his house for a while. Also, he was very interested in the figure of Ernst Junger, who was a prominent German officer who had an important post in Paris during the war and actually wrote diaries, which were subsequently published. Melville adapted the book. He also added to it a kind of more cinematic vision of the character of the German officer. He cast Howard Vernon as the officer, an actor who'd already played several such parts in other films. The arrival of the German officer, the first vision we have of him, we have the door opens and it's night outside, and he's shot as if he was in a German expressionist film of the 20s, like it's really, really dark, and it was almost like a figure out of a horror film. There are many scenes they're shot indoors in the library, and you can see great pools of darkness. And apparently Melville had trouble with the laboratories developing the film because they thought it was a mistake. It was too dark, but that is what he wanted. It was like breaking the rules of classical filmmaking in terms of the use of lighting is something that makes the film, to me, look very modern today.
Habt ihr es ermessen?
Glaubst du, wir werden uns sidieren? Wir sind von anderem Schlage.
Ihr wollt also Frankreichs Untergang auf ewig besiegen.
One can see the film belonging to a much wider context of French cinema and the way it dealt with the trauma of the German occupation, the war and the resistance, the defeat in 1939, 1940. A huge amount of people in France had neither collaborated nor resisted, but had been what is called attentistes, the people waiting for it to just getting on with their lives and hoping that it would finish. By writing a book that is symbolic and oblique about the resistance, which shows two people resisting by being silent, by simply refusing to speak to the German officer who's billeted with them. It's an allegory with the young woman, the niece, being kind of explicitly compared to an image of France. By making those characters almost abstract and symbolic, you can avoid talking about uncomfortable truth and conflict and divisions and all the messiness of the actual resistance and occupation. That would have involved talking about, for example, ideological conflict within the resistance, which was itself very divided between the communists, the non-communists. Also would have involved recognizing that many people did not resist. Vercor's book was hugely popular, but also criticized, especially after the war, for presenting resistance as passive, that you could see them as very admirable people who stand up to the German by not talking to him. It is also possible to see them as these people who simply wait until the war will be over. But their silence is at the same time extremely effective, and the book, but also the film, make us understand the power of the silence precisely against the flow of words that the German officer delivers night after night. This is not about action. This is about resisting through silence, through refusing to speak.
Il faut la boire à son sein. Il faut qu'elle vous offre son sein dans un mouvement et un sentiment maternel.
Silence also, of course, had particular, I think, connotations in terms of the resistance, because remaining silent, for example, under torture, was something absolutely crucial.
Un soir, j'étais monté dans ma chambre pour y chercher du tabac. J'entendis s'élever le chant de l'harmonium.
We hear the uncle speak because it's his voice-over narration that tells us his thoughts, her thoughts, and the whole story. She says one word in the film that we hear, and you have to strain to hear it. And in fact, on the first vision, it may not always be possible to hear it, is at the end, when the German officer leaves for good, and he says goodbye to them, and she says adieu to him, but extremely softly, so you barely hear it. And so the silencing of the niece is, I think, symbolic at another level of that kind of, in a sense, repression of the voice of women. This, of course, works towards giving her a very sort of enhanced allegorical quality. And she's very often shot in profile, and almost like a medallion, that her face in profile against the darkness is, I think, very effective. Because the resistance remains allegorical and there is no possibility of relationship between the German officer and the uncle and niece, nevertheless, we understand that love builds between the German officer and the niece. These relationships were very much considered criminal. So in Le Silence de la Mer, all this is avoided by having the resisting woman as an allegory and as a pure figure detached from all these considerations, because the possibility of having the actual relationship is removed from her. Le Silence de la Mer was shot on a modest budget with a very small crew and with a director of photography, Henri Dequet, who would become very famous later, who was used to working in difficult circumstances. And they worked in a house with, small rooms, very constrained circumstances. They had to borrow film stock. It's a film made on a shoestring, and it's true that had an influence on the way it looks, but it also, the way the film was made, its style, its use of images and sound, its minimalism in terms of there's very few characters involved, is also, I think, something that has to do with Melville's ideas about a new cinema. The filmmakers and critics of the New Wave would admire Melville later on was the innovativeness of his work, which made him stand out from the dominant mainstream cinema of the time in France, which became known as the tradition of quality or the cinema of quality, a term which was coined by critics like Truffaut as almost a term of abuse, so quality became a negative term. The tradition of quality, the accusation was that the scriptwriters rewrote the book. It's more an attack on the scriptwriters and the fact that the scriptwriters are more important almost than the director. It's a plea for the director to become somebody in control, whether they adapt a book or not. So in a sense, we're untrue to the book. Whereas Melville was true to the book, and I think that it's that sense of authenticity, of truth, which would make him stand apart from the tradition of quality. Over the rest of his career, Melville became known to most people for a maker of great thrillers, gangster films like Bob le Flambeur in 1956, Le Doulos, Le Samouraï in 1967, Le Cercle Rouge. What I find fascinating about Le Silence de la Mer, and perhaps this is a retrospective view, of course, is the fact that I think in the opening of Le Silence de la Mer, one can see almost like in embryo, both, of course, the resistance story, since that is what it is being introduced, but also the thriller, his love of the gangster film. The way those two men meet on the street, one man hands over a suitcase to the other one. In that suitcase, you see some clothes, and underneath some resistance newspapers, and then underneath a book. It's almost like it could really be in a thriller and somebody doing a drop, and the two men could be gangsters, the way they look.
Jawohl, aber.
Machen Sie 5 Durchschläge und schicken Sie einen an die Einheiten der Region.
Jawohl, aber.
It's quite a slow film, but there is a sense of suspense. To me, is the hallmark of what he will do with his thrillers. They are great gangster films, but they're also extremely minimalist. I think Melville is absolutely unique in being able to make films that are so tense and at the same time so slow. There's a sense of menace in Le Silence de la Mer. I think the way the soundtrack, for example, uses the clock, the use of darkness, the looks and gestures, communicating through just the look as opposed to words, is something that he exploits. Two gangsters usually communicate entirely through gestures and without having to say anything. And I think that one could see that the relationship between the uncle and the niece as again, the sort of the matrix for that, the way in which they understand each other without speaking. And in fact, on one or two occasions on the soundtrack, the uncle says, "We didn't discuss that, but we agreed tacitly." So even like the decision not to speak to the German officer, he says, "We didn't consult each other, we just did it." That silence is something that he then will carry over in a number of his other films. And I think it's quite interesting in terms of something which, for example, Godard would do later on, and which is considered extremely modernist. And there it is in that film of 1949. This was, in some ways, somebody who was both extremely experienced in the history of cinema by having seen virtually everything, and at the same time not having made a film himself. So I think, therefore, being free to experiment to some extent. The result is a film that looks extremely modern.